So in debating what it was that we're going to do for the next series of shiurim, and typically we do usually between 8 and 12 on a given topic before switching, and I think it's also enjoyable, at least that was my impression, that we split the shiurim up into one portion halacha, one portion more musar hashkafa. So I think that we picked some interesting topics. So there are some very let's say miscellaneous halachot to Shabbat that I think don't really get enough attention. We spend a lot of time talking about cooking and how to cook on Shabbat because really the only important thing on Shabbat is the food. We don't really discuss other malachot which are perfectly deoraita and that no one else, people don't study as much or take quite as seriously or just aren't that informed about. And when it comes to the musar and hashkafa aspect of the shiur, we'll be talking about Hilkhot Shabbat, and there's a reason for that. We'll explain that maybe when we start that particular part of the shiur, but I think it's very relevant to what's going on in the world today. Naturally, whenever there are, struggles, debates, battles, fights, wars, etc., I think more damage is done by the lack of cohesion and the nature in which we engage in these debates and discussions than by the actual knives and bullets and bombs, which can only hurt a certain number of people at a time. So when it comes to Hilkhot Shabbat, just a little bit of background. Obviously, we have 39 avot malachot. We have 39 forms of, we'll call them constructive or productive work of one kind or another. I'm not going to say unqualified work because that's not true. The Rambam says if you want on Shabbat, you can take a sofa and you can drag it up 10 flights and down 10 flights. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't violate the Shabbat. Maybe it's not such an advisable way to spend or waste your Shabbat. Technically, you could lift weights, which is also hard work, but that's not melacha. And at the same time, you can sign a check and you're going to hell. I mean, how did that happen? You sign a check and you're here all of a sudden, hayav deoraita, you did something worse than... so it's certainly not a function of physical work. Striking a match and lighting a cigarette, which is also deoraita, and you would say, well, how strenuous an effort is that? How difficult is that to accomplish?
Yeah, and hosting 20 people is no big deal.
Exactly. But really the food is the ikar, it's the foundation of the Shabbat, so obviously we have a situation of pikuach nefesh, everything is permitted when it comes to food. So there's, there are the basics, the fundamentals. We'll talk a little bit more about this in detail before we get to the technical details of writing on Shabbat. But when it comes to what's asur on Shabbat, in order for something to be asur on Shabbat, it has to be, in order for it to be asur mideoraita, it be biblical interdiction. It doesn't have to appear in the Bible, all right? Already we have this issue. We have it with a lot of halachot, that we have what's called halachal Moshe Misinai. What's halachal Moshe Misinai? HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe, keep Shabbat. He didn't tell him how to violate it. He didn't tell him what constitutes a violation of the Shabbat. Perhaps we have at least two examples, according to most opinions, at least two examples, three really, of violations of the Shabbat. Lo tuvaru esh b'chol moshavotechem b'yom HaShabbat. So we can't ignite fires on Shabbat. This also became a dispute. Can we benefit from fires, or we just can't, where we can benefit, we just can't ignite them or extinguish them? Or is it actually asur even to benefit from the fire on Shabbat? The Qara'im, the Karaites, were the ones who made this mistake. It was a misunderstanding on their part. Literally, we're not allowed to start or spread fires or even feed them on Shabbat, which isn't to say that we can't benefit from them. Just you have to know how to do it. But that's an explicit midoraita example, one of 39 melachot that otherwise aren't explained very explicitly in the Shabbat. What else do we have in terms of what's asur explicitly in the Torah?
Chopping wood, or carrying something.
So bundling wood, there you go, because the Mekoshesh Etzim, we're told explicitly that he's violated the Shabbat, he has to be punished. So from here we can infer that you can't bundle or tie things or collect things into a pile on Shabbat, and we'll have to discuss that as well. And maybe we're not allowed to leave one rashut for another if it's because we're carrying, or if it's a matter of traveling too far outside of the Tchum. Probably it's a matter of carrying, because carrying Tchum Shabbat, it's that you have 2,000 amot in either direction is also a worthwhile discussion to entertain. So there are the overwhelming majority of these malachot which do not appear explicitly in the Torah. They are halakha Moshe Misinai. Where do we learn? What's the source for these isurim? Easy. Parashat Vayakhel. We have the beginning of the parasha. Vayakhel Moshe et kol bnei Israel. All of the Jewish nation is congregated, and he tells them, "Here's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us. You can work on the 6 days of the week. On Shabbat, you're not allowed to work." And then he goes on to explain to them how the Mishkan was constructed. the materials and the sizes, the dimensions, and the gold and silver, the dyed wool, the different, if it's goat wool, if it's sheep wool, if it's silk thread or gold thread or silver thread. We have plenty of silver and gold and atzei shitim that we need to collect, etc. The olive oil for different purposes. Fine. So here Chazal said, this is the Torah telling you, this is an indication that those things that were done in the Mishkan or for the purpose of the construction, the erection of the Mishkan, are those things that are forbidden for you to do on Shabbat. There are 39 avot melachot. There are 39 forms of, let's say, archetypal forms of work, or creative work, or constructive work, or labor that are forbidden on the Shabbat. So we can't burn, we can't cook, we can't slaughter animals because that was also part of the process. They needed skins, the orot tahashim and orot elim. There's the skins of the tahash, which is an animal that doesn't exist today, and the skins of goats and rams. They used, we had the korbanot themselves also.
Which was that animal?
The tahash. Well, she explains it's a multicolored animal that no longer exists. Used to exist, and it was it went extinct apparently after this process.
And we need it again to rebuild the...
I don't know. I don't believe it appeared in the Beit HaMikdash either. Just for the Mishkan in particular, because they had to cover utensils with them, and that was because it was portable and they had to travel. The utensils had to be covered. So the Mishkan itself had to be covered. The Mizbeach had to be covered. The menorah had to be covered. Once we have a permanent Beit HaMikdash, nothing needs to be covered anymore. We just have curtains between different chambers. So when it comes to the melacha of kotev, of ketiba, what's asur mideoraita is writing. So what kind of writing is asur mideoraita? How do we define? I mean, if I'd like to successfully transgress this avira, how do I accomplish it?
Is it about writing two letters next to each other or something like that?
I need to write two letters. They need to be read as two letters. Where do we get this?
That I don't know.
Anybody, any intrepid souls who did a little bit of reading or who found that they have a really cute children's books with pictures of these melachot?
It's not in the Beit HaMikdash when you have to connect, when you have to connect the two different pieces?
Well, not on the Beit HaMikdash because the Beit HaMikdash nothing has to be reconstructed.
The Mishkan.
So in the Mishkan.
Right.
In the Mishkan, the Mishnah tells us they had a system for identifying where the different planks that go in the wall, that compose the walls of the Mishkan, how they would identify which plank goes where. Because they were designed to fit, they had rings and they had these joints that they would attach them with. So each plank got two letters. One letter told you which wall it was from, and the other letter told you which number it was in the series. And so this way you knew where the pieces go. So in order for me to imitate what was done exactly as it was done in the Mishkan, I would have to write two letters. Because one letter isn't really intelligible, it doesn't give you very much information. Okay? And we need to understand that a melacha that's done partially, in some cases, will not yield a transgression. It doesn't constitute a transgression of the Shabbat. We're tempted to say it does because we like to send people to hell. But the reality is, if you've only done half a melacha, you may not have accomplished the transgression. It might require a little bit more effort on your part if you'd really like to get where you're trying to go. So, writing two letters is asur mideoraita. So by definition, before Abigail jumps up with the answer, what's the nature of the interdiction to write one letter?
Midrabanan.
Midrabanan. So why is it asur midrabanan?
It's a defense.
Right. It's what we call because first of all, we like to send people to hell. Second of all, in this case, they go to hell with a few lashes on their back. Right. Yes. So, kol ma'id takun chachamim me'in deoraita takun. Okay? Literally, what does it mean? Everything the chachamim decreed, everything, every single takana, every single gzera, anything that Chazal added onto the Torah by way of requirements of our observance, they did it only because it's similar to, or only in order to imitate the laws of the Torah. In other words, why do we have Yom Tov Sheni? Only because you can get confused, and because this concept of violating Yom Tov is so risky and so dangerous, they came up with this theory. There's a calculation by which we can add a day of Yom Tov. We're going to give up on a day of putting on tefillin, but it's going to prevent us from doing something even worse. In other words, it protects a well-known mitzvah, or a lesser-known mitzvah, or a lesser-known detail of a mitzvah. So other items that are midrabanan, why do we do netilat yadayim before we handle food? There was a time, back in the day, we used to give terumah and ma'aser. You had to be in a state of tahara in order to do this. If you give terumah and ma'aser to a kohen, and you've managed to contaminate it, he himself might be chayav karet for eating it, and it's a really big deal. So kohanim don't take terumot and ma'aserot to ma'amei haaretz. They would give them to their animals. They wouldn't eat them for themselves. It's very clever. Kohanim can own animals, and their animals are entitled to eat from the Torah Maaser, just like the Kohen himself. So if it's Tameh, you have a Safek, you give it to the animals. If you're hungry, you go to a Tamid Chacham, or at least what's called a Haver, in language of Mishnah. That means someone who observes the mitzvot, and someone who knows to be careful when it comes to how he handles his grains, his olives, his grapes, and eventually other things that were included, midrabanan. Speaking of which, why do we take Turma Maaser from anything that's not Dagan Tirosh V'Yitzhara?
Apples?
Dagan means grains, so it's wheat, barley, and the other subspecies, which are oats, rye, and spelt. And then you have Tirosh, which is everything that comes out of the vine. So Tirosh would be grapes or raisins or grape juice or wine, any combination thereof.
It's not corn?
Tirosh literally means corn.
Or tiras?
Tiras. Which, by the way, is a perfectly made-up word in Hebrew. It was very clever. They just took a word that they found no etymology for. Nothing. It's common. If you look, clever guy Ben Yehuda. I'm not condoning or condemning the man. All I'm saying is that they had lots and lots of words in Hebrew, and they didn't know what they meant. I mean, we know, for example, there are lots of names of animals, birds, fish, plants, fruits, and we don't know what they correspond to because most of us weren't living in Israel. So what he did was they came to Israel and they just stuck random names on things. They just assumed it was better to have a Hebrew word for it than to use the Latin word for it, or to use the Greek, the German or the Greek or the French. So you end up with birds that are misnamed and fruits and vegetables and animals that are misnamed, right? Classically, the tapuah. Tapuah means what in Hebrew? Etrog. تحت التفوح أوررتيخ شمع حبلات خيمها شمع حبلات لداتها.
I thought you were talking about modern Hebrew.
So there's only one Hebrew, and the language they speak today in modern Israel. When they say tapuah, they mean this a fruit that grows on trees of the rose family, and apples and pears are related that way. And there's what they call tapuah matok, is how some of the Rishonim referred to it because they didn't have them in North Africa and most of Europe. They were introduced by the Caucasus Mountains. From there they spread to the rest of the world. So they're popular, they're sweet, but the tapuah means an etrog. So the minhag on Rosh Hashanah, before everyone gets all upset, the Rama writes, the minhag is to eat a tapuah matok bidvash. So not to eat an etrog. Etrog is bitter and nasty unless you cook it with sugar and candy it. So what the minhag was to eat a sweet apple. They didn't have apples in North Africa, at least not until relatively recent history. So they used to cook quinces.
Oh, that's what
Hamush.
Yeah.
That's the minhag. That was to eat the.
Because they don't have apples, that's why it's always coming.
So the minhag itself isn't an originally Sephardi minhag, I guess, because Ashkenazim had access to the Caucasus Mountains first. They started eating for them. Anyway, but you have a lot of examples of this. You have birds and fish and plants that definitely don't mean what they're called today. It's just it is what it is. They had a lot of words and they wanted to.
Leviathan, is it really what it was?
No, Leviathan, yeah, no?
Yeah, it's not at all clear what that refers to.
That's also a fake, that's a fake fish. So like it's a fake word for a fake fish.
It's not clear. So it sounds from the Midrashim that they're no more Levitanim.
Right.
So it's not clear what we're referring to. When we say that Yonah was swallowed by Daga, probably it was a relatively large marine animal. If it was a mammal or a fish, it's not so crucial to the story. But the Taninim Gedolim, you find that Tanin does refer to, like by, was in Yeshaya, where he addresses the Par'o of that time, and refers to him as Hatanin Hagadol Harovetz Betoch Hayor, like the giant Tanin that's crouching in the Nile. So the crocodile is probably what it's referring to. If that's the same thing as Tanin Gedolim in Bereshit, so hard to come down with an axe on some of these things. But just know that because the name for something in modern Hebrew is what it is, it doesn't mean that it's correct. Simamit, Sin Memem Yod Tau. In modern Hebrew, they use it to refer to these little lizards, these little geckos that they have all over the place that eat cockroaches. So Simamit in the language of Mishlei, for example, is a spider. I don't know how they made that up. I mean, you can make it up when no one knows Tanakh and they just listen to you and take what you say for granted. So, we have midrabanan. We take Truman Maaser from items that aren't the three that are explicitly mentioned in the Torah a number of times. Maaser v'ganecha, tiroshecha v'yitzharecha, v'chorot be'karacha v'tzonecha. Midoraita, there are four things that you have to take Maaser, from which you have to take Maaser. One is Dagan, which means grains. Number two is Tirosh, which means grapes, whatever comes off the vine. Number three is Yitzhar. Yitzhar refers to the olive tree. So olives, olive oil, at whatever point in the process you realize that you didn't take maaser, you take it at that point, it's okay. If you have olive oil, take 10% of the oil. If you have olives, take 10% of the olives. That would be your maaser. Chazal added on top of, and then you have the animals. Your firstborn animals. It's also technically called. It is a tithe. It's 10%. You take your animals once a year, and you let them go. Every 10th one you designate for maaser. 10% of the herd is meant. So it sounds like a lot. The reality is that if every one of your females is pregnant, then your herd almost doubles in size every year. So to take 10% out of that, it's not a very large number. Anyway, it's sustainable. So why do we take Terumah and Maaser from herbs, from spices, from other fruit trees, for example? So the apple
Money
or the etrog.
Money included. Or is
And
that something different?
that's somewhere between a minhag and a good piece of advice. I don't mean to discourage anybody from giving it. Certainly encourage people to give more. Most especially if you give to the Beit Knesset, right? It's a zechut for you and for all of your descendants to come. But that's not that. There is an opinion that wants to hold that's midoraita, because Yaakov Avinu makes this neder where he says, so he says, the problem with that opinion, meaning it's nice that he says this, but if Yaakov is saying, please save me, give me food, give me clothing, and allow me to deal with corrupt psychopaths, and all this, in return, what am I giving you? I'll give you 10% of everything that I make. So if he has an obligation to do this, him fulfilling his obligation is not exactly extra credit.
Right.
So if he's telling Hashem, protect me, why? Because I'm going to do something that I'm obligated to do anyway, but I'd really like for you to protect me. It doesn't work that way. You want to get extra credit, you can do something beyond what you're required to do. So the majority conclusion of the Bet Yosef and the Rishonim is that it's not a chovah. It's nice that he, volunteered to do this. In fact, the reason that it might have helped save him is because he wasn't, by definition, required to. So, at any rate, but that's another example of a takana midorabanan that's really there to protect something else, because olives, grapes, and grains effectively comprised maybe 70, maybe 80% of the diet of Mediterranean antiquity. It's very easy for people to confuse things or to get them wrong. So what do Chazal say? Easy. So we don't make a mistake with what's ultimately midoraita, and that it involves a number of potentially grave interdictions, among them karet. How do we solve the problem? Take a maaser from everything. Everything. Every nut. Every herb, every leaf, every fruit, every vegetable, even though the Torah makes no mention of them, you take maaser from it, and that's it. So why did they do this? It seems like it's a very excessive takana. In the end, they only did it to protect the most important items, so we shouldn't forget this concept of Torah and maaser. Every time you sit down to eat, you have to ask, was maaser taken or not? And this way, you won't make the mistake of saying, well, that's obligated, that's not, etc. That's how we avoid problems.
That's only if it's something that's cultivated by a Jew, right?
If it was grown in Eretz Yisrael on land owned by a Jew, regardless of who was growing it.
So if I own something somewhere outside of Israel,
You're
I
not
don't need to do
obligated.
any of
No,
these.
you don't give any of these things. That's right.
But it doesn't, the principle itself, right, doesn't assume a certain level of ignorance of the general people.
You're bothered by this for what
No, I'm not.
rational reason?
No, I'm
No,
not.
because you always teach us that we
would you
should,
be wrong? Would you be wrong if you were to assume that the overwhelming majority of people in the world are ignorant?
Not for the Jewish people at the time. I mean, the Jewish people that they're supposed to be, I wouldn't assume that. Like, the Jewish people who follow the Torah, for whom this system is designed for,
Uh-huh.
I wouldn't assume that.
You mean to say what? You mean to say that this system was designed for the Jewish people? It was designed for the entire Jewish people, or it was only designed for people that went to David Meir Sasson's elementary school?
Well, I wouldn't recommend that, but,
The only thing wrong with Italy today is the elementary school that you attended.
Exactly. So, but no, but what I'm saying is, like, if you think about, like, we praises ourselves to be, even to be founded on the concept that everybody is supposed to study Torah and observe mitzvot and everything, not just for the small class of people. So if you assume that everybody should do it and will do it, at the same time there are all these provisions, it means that they know from the very beginning that that's not going to happen.
Okay.
So it's, what I'm trying to say is
What you're trying to say is that you're making an equation between what everyone is supposed to do and what everyone actually does.
No, I'm making an equation between, it's like it's intrinsic in the mechanism, it's intrinsic in the system, there is a mechanism that takes in account the fact that people will not do what they are saying. Which is fine.
That people won't do what they're saying.
Will not, yeah,
Won't do what they're told to do.
What they're told to, right.
So your perspective is the perspective of the Torah.
Yeah.
Of the Torah Shebichtav. In other words, your perspective is the Midoraita perspective. The Torah is timeless. It doesn't assume everyone's religious. It doesn't assume everybody's not religious. It's telling you what needs to be done. The job of the Chachamim is to make this work. And so you make this work. Look, I'll concede that there's a great amount of sacrifice that goes into doing this. Because we lose things when we have to be mahmirim. Okay? I don't know how well you guys know me. Those of you who ever asked me a question on any halachic issue have probably come to appreciate the fact that my job is not to be mahmir. I mean, I can tell you what Ikar Hadin is, what we can get away with, what we can't, what's advisable, what's not. That's not to say that I assume you're going to listen to me. And so, no offense to anyone in this room or outside of this room, but I will not give the same answer to two different people. That's usually the way someone who's halachically responsible gives answers. There's also the reality that, your job is to know your people, know your community, know the generation, and make responsible decisions. If you're too mahmir, it costs money, it costs time. Maybe people get tired and they just leave the whole thing altogether. That's too complicated, too many deals, too many restrictions, too many limitations, too many things that we're not allowed to do. I don't want to do any of it. And so people like this, they throw away midorata, throw away midorabanan, throw away minhagim, throw everything away. Then on the other hand, you have the reality that people are not educated. Even worse, you have people who believe that they're educated, or people who think they know better than you, or think they know halacha. And it makes life very, very complicated. So we don't have the authority to make zerot or to make taqanot. Think about that. Think about that. If the purpose of the Chachamim is to protect the Torah, and they protect the Torah either by being strict in most cases, or sometimes lenient in other cases, at least just to protect the essence of the mitzvot, that's a condemnation of whom? That we can't make zerot or tachanot in this generation. Think about this. If we no longer have the authority to make zerot or taqanot, or to undo them,
It's our son.
well, it's a condemnation of the whole generation. Most particularly, who would be the ones making such zerot or such taqanot? What did I just tell you they have to know and be conscious of and cognizant of in order to make zerot and taqanot?
Their generation is.
So effectively what we're saying is the Chachamim of this generation aren't Chachamim, which I've been saying it for years. But the reality that the Chachamim can no longer be trusted to make taqanot and zerot that are both effective and sustainable is as much an indictment of them as it is of the generation. So it's unfortunate that we don't have real Chachamim in this generation who do have the authority to make, let's say, more far-reaching zerot and taqanot. At the same time, the sad reality is the fact that even the Chachamim aren't doing what they're supposed to. You're talking to me about your simple proletariat citizens, and I'm telling you it's worse. Even the Chachamim don't have the authorities that they were supposed to have. We don't have real smicha the way we used to have it, and we don't have the authority to make zerot and taqanot the way we used to make them. Why not? Because neither the people, nor the Chachamim, or if you will, the entire generation isn't where it's supposed to be. But that's not to say that there's no response, or there's no expectation on the part of the Torah that we find a way to get as many mitzvot observed as we can. So we try. But yes, it's true. The Chachamim assumed a certain degree of ignorance on the part of people. They weren't really wrong about that. I don't know if most of the people that you know study Torah in depth and in detail and understand all the mitzvot. Maybe in fashion they're more learned and more sensitive to halachic detail than they are in kashrut.
No, but I agree with you, but it looks to me that it's something that, it's not that it took them like thousands of years to realize. Like right away it's there.
So what you're asking me is, why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu make his gzerot and taqanot midoraita?
No, they didn't ask that.
To give us some kind of leeway or something?
But if you think about it, Moshe Rabbeinu himself, it says one of the speech in Devarim, he says that I know that you are not going to do, you're not going to do whatever you're supposed to, and you're going to fall.
And he still didn't give them humrot.
Right.
And he still didn't do it. Okay. Maybe if he's the one giving the commands, people took them more seriously. Except for Rav Avidan, I think people took them more seriously. I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. It's a perfectly legitimate question. I don't know. It'd be very hard to answer that. I don't know. At the end of the day, what we have is a concern that we're going to mix things up. So, I mean, back to our most local detail. If you're writing one letter on Shabbat, you're violating a rabbinic interdiction that's really only there to prevent you from writing two. Fair enough? That's it. I'm not saying we should all get in the habit of writing one letter on Shabbat, but writing or even really creating a letter already becomes a problem. So why is that? So really, technically, you need to write two letters in order to violate the Isur Midoraita. Or actually, you can take a letter that's composed of two and just erase the middle. Right? Very interesting. When it comes to Hilkhot Stam, the reason that a chet in a Sefer Torah, the reason that a chet in a modern Sefer Torah looks like two zayins with a triangular roof on top is because the Gemara says, what happens if on Shabbat, it's Mishnah, what happens if on Shabbat I erased the middle of the roof of the chet and I created two zayins? And here Tosafot say, so from here you understand that a chet is created by making two zayins. Because in antiquity, most of the communities were writing a chet with basically like a rish and a well, and that's the chet that Rashi advises. That's what he says. This is how a rish is written. Now, when he says, the Gemara says, the Mishnah says that when you erase the middle of a rish, you create the middle of the chet, you create two zayins, and he says not exactly two zayins, like a vav and a zayin, but it's the same thing. And the Tosafot say, no, if the Gemara says two zayins. So like the argument over how do we violate this Isur on Shabbat actually informed how we are supposed to write a chet in a Sefer Torah, because by not even writing two letters, just by erasing the connection between two potential letters, I've actually violated this as well.
Isn't that where something I mean, answering your question, the process of, okay, well now we don't have, we don't have our, we have, sure, what is the biblical, what's the word? Biblical
Interdiction.
What?
Interdiction, like the Isur.
Yeah, the biblical, the Midoraita, and then the process of finding out what the Rabbanan, there's benefit to be gained from the actual process. So
meaning learning why Chazal decreed
well,
what they decreed.
I mean, the whole compilation of Talmud is kind of the back and forth, right? And there's some
absolutely. I'm a huge advocate for understanding these things. First of all, everything that Chazal decreed has a rationale to it. It's not Kabbalah. That's it. If it's a Asur Midorabanan, I want to know why. Asur Midoraita, sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. That's fine. It's okay. Commit to humility. You may not understand all the mitzvot. When it comes to Midorabanan, it has to make sense.
Right.
By definition, it has to make sense. It might make sense because one opinion holds this might be the Isur Midoraita, one opinion holds this might be it. So you might have Midorabanan say, oh, we do both. Right. How can you do both if it can only be one or the other? Well, it's not so simple. Sometimes we're concerned for this, we're concerned for that. If you will, it's Midorabanan that we start Shabbat before the Shkiah and we end it after Tzitzit Chavim. Whereas biblically, Shabbat is supposed to begin and end, at least it seems this way from the Gemara, it's supposed to begin and end at the same time.
So it should be 24 hours.
Well, let's say 24 hours, give or take a minute, because the days are getting longer or shorter from one to the next. So Shabbat should be, in theory, depending on where you are also in terms of lines of latitude, because in Scandinavia it's going to be more or less by a bigger deviation. So if Shabbat is supposed to begin with the Shkiah, it should end with the Shkiah. If it begins with Tzedek Chavim, it ends with Tzedek Chavim. Right. So what do we do? Midrabanan, we have this time called Ben Hashmashot that we don't have a clear definition of, and so we're careful, we steal from the profane, secular, regular days of the week in order to pad Shabbat to make sure that we don't violate it, not before and not after. So that's technically Midrabanan because of a doubt. Oh, it's a doubt that should have been resolved. Kabbalistically speaking, there is an importance to this time, there's a reason why it's this way, but in technical, practical, halachic terms, that's Midrabanan. Why is it Midrabanan? Because there's an opinion holds that Shabbat starts at Shkiah, opinion holds that it starts at Tzedek Chavim, and the prevailing opinion is we should be careful for both, because if Shabbat is Midoraita, we don't take the chance. So there's more than one reason, more than one potential reason why we might, it could be that it's the ignorance of the people. That was David's case from the Holy Roman Empire. It can also be the inability of Hazal to draw a conclusion one way or the other, meaning they were afraid or they didn't know or they weren't sure who had more authority or how it was proper to rule halakha, so they'll protect themselves on both ends. We'll limit our potential liability, our potential exposure to Yisurim by being strict, even though we know only one opinion technically could be true. You have things like this. So I didn't mean to, it's an introduction if nothing else, There are a couple of details I wanted to get into, but I'd hope to get more into the details of worst comes to worst. We'll do it next week. But the introductions are as important as the details, because this is how melachot are done. Let me just give a little bit of background, because we're going to talk about more than just this next week. We're going to break for a few minutes, and then we'll continue with the Chafetz Chaim. There are other conditions that a melacha must meet in order to successfully transgress the Shabbat. So if I'm bent on violating Shabbat, I can't wait to go to hell. I'm just trying to find the right method to get there as effectively and efficiently as possible. So I want to violate the Shabbat. How do I do it? Okay, David says writing 2 letters is a pretty good way to accomplish this. Writing 2 letters with what? How close to each other? On what? What if I'm writing on something that does or doesn't hold ink?
What letters?
Right, what letters? Perfectly valid
ABCs in a
question.
letter.
These are all very poignant and very relevant questions. What if I wrote one letter and Yohan wrote the other? And we promise not to tell. What if I'm writing with something that itself, I can write on a legitimate substrate, but what if I'm writing with some kind of an ink that's not permanent? Right? So an erasable ink, what if I'm writing with graphite, like a pencil?
What if I'm forming letters with Play-Doh or something?
Right, there you go. Or what if I'm writing letters on a cake? Or for that matter, if I'm taking letters off the cake, like I'm eating it or cutting it into pieces. Cutting into pieces up, you gotta say, wait a second, you told me before, if you split the middle of a chet, you made 2 zayins. So if I happen to cut up my son Hanoch's birthday cake because it's on Asara B'Tevet and he gets a big fat cake that he can't eat. So if I cut the chet in Hanoch in half, in theory I created 2 letters, so if Asara B'Tevet fell out on Shabbat and for some reason we decided not to observe the fast, so I might be going to hell but for a different reason. If I cut the chet right in the middle and I created 2 letters out of it, does it count even though it was cake? So one of the features, there's a question? No. One of the questions that we have.
It's like when you open a bag of food to eat, the same thing.
It's another famous question. That we'll talk about next week also. In theory, this is also a potential issue. That has to do with the concept of mechika, which, by the way, is also a discussion. Most of the melachot, I should say, many of the melachot, their opposite is also a problem. In the case, for example, of construction, right? Boneh. So how do they build the Mishkan? Easy. They built, right? Adam's family is Libyan. He knows that Libyans built. So they built the Mishkan. They constructed it. They actually erected walls. What happens when you construct on Shabbat? You're doing something similar enough to what was done in the Mishkan, and you violated the Shabbat. When I decide to, let's say, expand my kitchen, or to knock down a wall between 2 rooms, I'm not building per se, or what if I choose only to do this deconstructive act on Shabbat? So look, I know I can't build on Shabbat. I'm going to break the wall on Shabbat because that's not asur, and I'm going to finish the touches and a little bit of plaster, a little bit of paint after Shabbat. So destroying something on Shabbat, at least in terms of construction, is asur midrabanan. Why? Because it itself can become or can be perceived a form of construction. So my kitchen, it's worth more or less when I break down the wall and now make it bigger, or when I adjoin it to the neighboring room. Could be that I increase the value of my apartment. So effectively what I've done, and it also necessitates a little bit of construction just to touch it up. So everyone agrees that that if you're destroying something but for the purpose of reconstructing it, this too is part of construction. That's how construction happens. You'll make a ceiling, and then you'll drill holes in it in order to put things through it, or to support things from it, or to attach, ceiling tiles or electric cables, etc. So sometimes undoing something is in and of itself either a melacha or it's a asur midrabanan, so you shouldn't be involved in this kind of thing in general. Another example of this would be extinguishing a fire. You have a fire on Shabbat. So what did the Torah say? We quoted it before. Lo tevaru esh b'chol moshavotechem b'yom HaShabbat. So Shlomo says, listen, I'm not lighting any fires on Shabbat, but I'm really good at putting them out. And I like to play with fire. So I can satisfy my pyromaniacal urge by extinguishing fires on Shabbat. So this technically is asur for a reason you'll find in Masechet Shabbat, the 2nd chapter, B'mem Dekim. Right? המכבה את הנר על פני שמתעורר מפני גויים, מפני אסתים, מפני רוח רע, מפני החולה שישן פטור, כחסר כתיר החייב. ובסדר פטור לכנו חוץ ופטרה, מפני שהוא עושה פחם. Sometimes by extinguishing a fire, you actually create something else. What did you create? So my grandfather, Alav Shalom, in Morocco used to make charcoal. This was his parasa, it was a business. His father got into it and he himself ran the business. He had 3 Mercedes trucks before they left Morocco. This was considered an empire at the time. So my grandfather, Sion Avner, Alav Shalom, would go up into the shluch. He would take a bunch of Berber workers with him. They would cut down a bunch of trees, they would dry them a little bit, then they would burn them. And they would burn them until the outside was black, and they would pour water over it in order to put out the fire. Now you have what's called charcoal, right? To char something in English means to burn, like to carbonize it, you would say in French. So you take wood and you burn it, and then you extinguish the fire. And this way, when you light it, it's not going to flame so much as it's going to glow. It's just going to get hot. But you don't have to cook with a violent flame. You cook with something much more controlled, which we've been doing for thousands of years. So by extinguishing a fire on Shabbat, they've actually created charcoal. And by creating charcoal, I've done something that's a source to do on Shabbat. Therefore, both the lighting of the fire and the extinguishing of it are forbidden. Extinguishing a fire can be part of a productive process. Anything you want to cook, you don't want to overcook. So you can either take it off the fire, or you can extinguish the fire. So part inherent to the cooking process is also the ability to extinguish a fire when necessary, etc. Anyway, so erasure on Shabbat technically is probably only a sur midarabanan, except for Rav Avidan's question, what if I erase in such a way that I create? Sometimes you'll write something and you'll make a mistake. So back then, they didn't throw away paper because it was expensive. Actually, most of it was parchment. So they would scratch it. They would scratch it out. I don't know if you've ever done any calligraphy, if you know somebody who does. In calligraphy, if you want to save a really nice piece of work that you accidentally messed up, the only thing you can do is you take a small knife, little surgical knives, and you sit there scratching it out. That's how you fix a Sefer Torah. You're writing and the letters got stuck, you just get really good at scratching things off, and that's how you do it. So effectively, I can either create 2 letters, or I can save a word by scratching out the connection between them. I've created 2 kosher letters between them. So if my resh got stuck to my tzadi, now they're not kosher, and they became kosher only by virtue of my scratching the erroneous connection between the 2. And I therefore created 2 perfectly kosher letters, and now I'm in trouble. Now I have a problem. Except that erasing doesn't make kosher letters, but that's a separate story. Because you can't write a Sefer Torah by pouring ink over the Sefer and then scratching around the letters. That doesn't work. You didn't create a kosher letter by scratching around it, it's created by properly writing it. So it's what's called chak tochot in Stam terminology. Someone who scratches the insides of the letters in order to leave the shape of the letter on the outside. Anyway, it's a sur, at very least, midorabanan. In the case of creating an actual letter, then it would be midoraita. So the example, the Mishnah, you scratched the chet, you made 2 zayins, that's clearly a sur midoraita. So we hold from it not because it's kosher for Stam, but because people in culture, in writing culture, people see a letter that's stuck and they erase it and make it 2 kosher ones, they would accept it. Or if it was 2 stuck letters, they could fix it this way. So we're going to have to take a quick break now. We'll continue with the Chafetz Chaim in a couple of minutes, and we'll have to talk about birthday cakes. That's up next week.